And welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this session. We're excited to talk today about navigating the purchasing process in higher education. And we all know that this is especially timely because universities, community colleges, if you have kids in K-12, we're all heading back to school very soon. So while today's conversation is really aimed to help suppliers that sell or want to sell to higher ed institutions get some more insights, kind of get the inside scoop and work better as partners, we also welcome everyone. So I know we have some folks from the public agency side and the cooperative side joining the conversation today as well. So welcome, welcome. And as I shared, just really thrilled to have 3 leaders in higher education with us today. So Eric, Allison, Sarah, I'll ask you to each please briefly introduce yourselves and your organizations.
Sure. So I'll start. My name is Eric Dickey. I am the Chief Procurement Officer here at the University of North Florida. Previous to being here, I spent 10 years at the University of Alabama. Thank you all for being here.
I'll go next. Great. I'm Allison Canada. I'm with Warwick Community College, which is located in Maryland. I've been here at the college for 20 years this year. Prior to that, I did work in procurement for the private sector.
Perfect. Sarah?
Hi, so I'm Sarah Luther. I am the Director of Operations for NAP. And for those of you who are not familiar with NAP, it's the National Association of Educational Procurement. Our members are primarily procurement staff for small to very large universities, community colleges, as well as K through 12 schools. The working titles for our members are buyers, we've got data analysts, all the way up to directors and chief procurement officers. Prior to NAP, I also worked at a university for many years and was able to develop a lot of great relationships with suppliers and was able to move that over with my work now with NAP.
Awesome. Well, thanks all. And I'm Marielle. I'm CEO and founder here at Pavilion. I started my career not in higher ed, but as an early employee at a tech startup that served higher ed and has since gone public. So have some experience serving organizations in the higher ed space. And then I found my way into local government with the city and county of San Francisco. And I started Pavilion basically, based on my experience working in government, where I pretty quickly found I could pretty much buy anything online as a consumer, as a private citizen. But when I was spending millions of dollars, on behalf of the city, I was using emails, I was using phone calls, just all this other tech that hadn't really changed much since the 90s to make a buying decision. So I started Pavilion to solve that problem for public servants like myself, and wanted to just help us all be able to find and purchase from suppliers who had cooperative contracts more easily. So excited to share that Pavilion's now the go-to resource for state, local, and educational organizations looking to buy using those shareable or cooperative contracts. And for suppliers joining us today who are new to Pavilion, we essentially get your business in front of public entity buyers when they're actively looking to purchase from a supplier who has a cooperative contract. And just as a note, today when we talk about cooperative contracts, we're referring really broadly, not just to contracts from national and regional cooperatives, but also contracts from state and local agencies that include that cooperative or piggyback language in them. And Pavilion is not a cooperative. We don't generate our own contracts. Again, we're a place to help those public entity buyers who have a need find and work with suppliers who have been awarded those shareable or cooperative contracts. And as you can see, we have several partnerships in place where we're integrated into existing buyer workflows. And I'm proud to share that NAEP is one of them, where we've become the platform for member institutions of NAP to search and share cooperative contracts. Sarah, do you want to just say a couple words about our partnership and how this benefits members and suppliers as well?
Absolutely. So our relationship with Pavilion it helped us meet a highly requested NAP member benefit, which is a contracts database. So through the database that is with Pavilion, our members can, 1, easily share their contracts that they have, and 2, be able to view and potentially use the contracts from their peers. So previously that was kind of a very daunting process where it was dependent on emailing pretty much a limited network of your contacts, and then you have to wait on time for them to respond. So now with the partnership with Pavilion, our members can easily share and see instantly those contracts, which makes it a lot easier for them to be able to check that box done that that they needed on their current project. So it has definitely been a great member benefit for the NAP members.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I think we have just a little preview of what that looks like on the NAP page. And again, just some of the member institutions who have shared their contracts with the NAP community as well. Cool. Okay, well, shifting gears, let's hop into our agenda, and it's pretty action-packed for today. So first, we're going to talk about how to navigate purchasing pathways in higher education. So for today's conversation, we'll mostly be focusing on the experience of obviously higher ed, but specifically public higher education institutions versus private. So we know NAEP's membership includes both public and private, privately funded organizations in higher ed. We're going to focus on the public ones. And then we're going to go over how higher ed budgets work and how that impacts you as a supplier. And then finally, we're going to double click into how higher ed institutions are using cooperative contracts and how, as a supplier, you can effectively leverage your contracts when selling to this segment. And some of you also submitted your burning questions for the panelists when you signed up for this webinar. So thank you for doing that. And behind the scenes, as you've been registering and submitting those questions, we've structured today's presentation to work those questions in and try to address as many of them as we could. So that being said, if there are other questions that come up, inspiration strikes, you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom at any point in time. And my team will be monitoring that and helping to bubble up some of those questions along the way. So please go ahead and submit your questions if you missed out on surfacing or if inspiration strikes. And then finally, since many folks tend to ask this somewhere in the questions up front, as a reminder, the session will be recorded. So we'll be sharing the recording and the presentation slides with you after the webinar. Okay, so before I turn it over to the panelists to share all about their experience, I want to get us started with just getting kind of a sense or a pulse on the supplier audience we have today. So I understand not everyone's representing a supplier, but I think the vast majority of folks attending are. We have 2 poll questions to get us warmed up. So here's the first one, and it's how much does your business focus on selling to higher education? And there are a few different options there, as you can see. Feel free to eyeball this. It's just to help give us a sense of who's in the room. All right, I see a lot of answers, a lot of responses coming in. So we'll give it a couple more seconds here. Okay, last 10 seconds. Great. So we're going to go ahead and close that out. Thanks everyone who answered. And then we have, oh, okay, yeah. And then I think everyone should be able to see responses here. So it looks like a pretty good spread of folks who have a really strong focus all the way through. So great to kind of understand who's in the space. And it looks like for many of you, you're maybe getting started or want to grow your focus. And for a handful of you, you have some really great experience as well. Okay, our second poll is around understanding how much you sell through RFPs, so new bids, new solicitations, or proposals versus through cooperative contracts if you have them. So go ahead and we'll touch on both of these pathways, the new solicitation bid and the cooperative contract today. But we'd love to hear from you for your business, and totally fair if you don't know, we have an option for that one as well. Okay. We'll give you a couple more seconds. Still see some responses coming in. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and close this one out. Thanks for responding and again giving us a pulse for the breadth of experience that we have in the room. And as you can see, still pretty well spread out. It looks like the most common answer is majority through cooperative contracts, so 36%. And it looks like otherwise kind of evenly split, majority through new bids, or I'm not sure at all. I have no idea. Also pretty popular answers. So it's great. We have a range of experiences represented in our participants today, and we're excited. We have something for everyone in this response. So thanks for taking a couple of minutes to just give us a pulse of who's joining. So with this context, let's go ahead and dive into our discussion. So first up, higher ed purchasing pathways and how to navigate them. Bum, bum, bum. So very quickly, for suppliers who don't have as much experience working with higher ed for the public sector, navigating purchasing pathways can be tricky because of two things. Number one, they're legally required processes that organizations have to follow to buy. So from the outside looking in, this can feel kind of like there's a lot of process. And that process generally comes from compliance requirements that public institutions, including higher ed institutions that are public, all have to follow. And there are also multiple people involved. So we're going to dive into both of those pieces, starting with those different processes. And I'm going to run through these quickly, and then we're going to turn it over to our panelists to talk more about what this looks like in their own experience. So the purchasing process really depends on a number of factors, purchase amount, timelines. And if you're selling below a certain dollar threshold, departments can typically purchase off of their P cards. They can just go ahead and make a purchase. At the next level, there's an informal competition requirement. So the organization typically needs 3 quotes, then they can make a purchase. So there's some element of competition, but less burden to run a larger process. And then finally, for larger purchases or above threshold purchases, the organization can put out a new RFP, a new bid, or buy through an existing contract, or go through the sole source process. And that last option requires you to show that you're really the only one who can provide the product or service in the market, or there's a justification for skipping the competitive process. And since that sole source process really doesn't apply to most suppliers, we're focusing today's conversation on purchases that trigger that competitive process requirement. So either a new solicitation or bid, and to get to a contract, or piggybacking off an existing contract. And unless you've designed your business to never cross that threshold amount, you're going to want to have a solid strategy in place for above threshold purchases. And it's probably, like many of you reflected, a combination of cooperative purchasing and responding to new bids and RFPs. The complication here is that you have to navigate multiple stakeholders. So when we talk about who's doing the buying work, and again, this will come up in our discussion shortly, there's the department end user who's typically the decision maker and your champion in the sales process. But it's not enough just to convince the department end user to choose you, because you also have procurement, who are deeply knowledgeable. We've written, we think about them sometimes as guardians of the process. I heard someone say Sherpa the other day. I like to think about it maybe as like spirit guide, but their job is generally to make sure that the institution is following compliance requirements while also meeting the needs of their department end users. So they guide those internal customers in the departments around how to navigate that process successfully. And they can really be helpful assets to you and your sales teams in getting through that set of purchasing requirements too. So really important that these stakeholders are bought in as well. And with that context, we have a handful of questions that the audience has submitted around how departments and purchasing teams work together, how to engage these stakeholders when selling into higher ed. So I think to kick us off, Eric, Allison, would love to hear from you a bit about how your procurement teams work with departments in your respective organizations. Kind of lay out the picture for us.
Sure. So here at UNF, we are really centralized, but yet decentralized. At the end of the day, we have, departments that make decisions. I have 4 buyers in my office, but at the same time, the buyers in my office more are contract administrators, like you guys were already talking about. So the buyers are really the campus users, and they're looking at us for direction. And the biggest hiccups that we have sometimes are around quotes, because we have like you were talking about, minimum thresholds, things like that. We have under 10K. We usually go with a minimum of 1 quote. Between 10 and 75, we ask for 2. And between 75 and 100, we ask for 3. So over 150, that's when we reach our bid threshold, and my office is looking to get involved. The biggest thing I tell people, that is not by individual purchase, though. That is total cumulative across the year for a university. I'll dive into it later on when we talk some more, but the biggest thing to remember is it's not that one individual department, it's all of them. We're all cumulative.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out. I think so often we hear back from suppliers and end users alike who are really confused. They're like, hey, my purchase is so small. Why are you making me jump through all of these hoops? And it's because those purchases do add up over the course of a given year. And I know for not everyone, it's a year. We might have different timelines that we're looking at as well. So thanks for calling that out.
So at my college, we're a much smaller school. And so we are very centralized in our procurement. We work with the departments to help them identify what it is that they need, whether it be a product or a service, because in procurement, we can't tell them what they need, right? We just help them find a source to meet those needs. So our end users get their own quotes if it's under our bid threshold. So they get their 3 quotes that are required. And then when it goes through a centralized e-procurement system to come into procurement department, then we're reviewing to make sure that they're meeting all those compliance requirements, the policies, the state regulations. If it's grant funded, then the grant funding regulations. So we are, like Marielle said, we're facilitating that process and we're making sure that we're in compliance. If it's over our formal bid threshold, then that is when procurement will manage that RFP process. If we're using a cooperative contract, then we are making sure that we're following the cooperative as it was intended to be used. And I think we talk a little more about that later. But one of the most important things for us to note is it's important for our suppliers to understand who has authority to enter into a contract. Because oftentimes we run into situations where a supplier may be working with a faculty or staff in a different department and they're quoting something, they come to a verbal agreement, in their minds they're ready to go, and then it comes into procurement and something's not in compliance. And we hate to have that situation. We don't want to be an obstacle or a gatekeeper. It really breaks our hearts when we have to go back and tell a supplier, I'm so sorry that you've invested all this time with this faculty member. However, we can't proceed how you want to because of those policies and regulations.
Yeah, we were laughing among our team the other day. I don't know if you all follow the meme of like, of course I'm insert profession and then what you always do. But we were saying there's some sad ones where it's like, of course I'm in public procurement and I'm going to tell you that you have to go back and figure out how to buy that a different way because it's not in compliance. So yeah, it is a sad reality that procurement has to say no a lot of the times. And I think for suppliers, understanding how to avoid the no and sort of pave the path and engage early can be a game-changing tactic. So I think shifting gears a little bit, and Sarah, I know you were in the field in procurement previously too, so we'll ask you to kind of chime in based on that experience and then what you're seeing from NAPIM members as well. But all 3 of you, I think, hungry. We saw in the questions that were submitted, folks are really hungry to understand, how should they reach decision makers and how and when, like, should they or shouldn't they engage procurement directly? So can you speak a little bit to your preferences there, what you see being most effective when you engage with suppliers?
Sure, I'll start again. So in my mind, and I tell people this all across campus, it starts and ends in procurement. For you guys on the supplier side of the world, cold calls are great. Emails are okay too, but they usually end up just in a trash folder, as you can probably suggest or imagine, right? But try to set up some time to actually get into our office, come visit. That's my biggest piece of advice. Procurement can be your ally if you're trying to find inroads for a university. I personally, with my buyers here, we try to take on at least 2 meetings a month for vendors who we don't currently do business with at all. Trying to give those new inroads for businesses out there. Not everybody does that, and I understand that, but here that's a philosophy that I've kind of created, and I would like to continue doing that in the future. During those meetings, we talk to the supplier that's in the office with us, and we kind of explain, hey, this is how you do business with the university. We give them points of contact as well for department heads across campus. And then as they are leaving, usually myself or the associate director one send an email out to our campus users and say, hey, this company stopped by today. It'd be great if you'd give them 10 minutes of your time and, just hear what they have to say. So that's kind of the way we do it here at UNF. Sarah or Allison?
I can go. So I always encourage suppliers to scope out an institution's website, specifically the procurement website, because that is a great resource of information. Depending on how the organization is set up, it can give guidance on how to get started. So the information on the website is not only directed at suppliers and how to do business, but they also have information for their end users and what the process is on their end. So it can be very useful to understand what that process is, the information they have on their website, because that can help you in your conversations with an end user when they're wanting to procure something. And you could always nod to, oh, well, I know that the process, or it looks like the process here is that you need to get multiple quotes, or it looks like based on the dollar amount, we may need to go to bid. So you can help. Knowing that information going into a meeting can be very valuable. I would also suggest finding out if an institution has a supplier showcase or a vendor show that they put on for the campus community. That's a really good opportunity to meet and engage with the end users on campus. Sometimes it can be very hard to navigate that. So those opportunities, you find those people that already are involved in the procurement process for their department. And then to build on that, NAP also provides a lot of opportunities to engage with institutions at our regional and national meetings as well. Allison?
Yeah.
I just want to add on to that, that absolutely research, if you're targeting a specific college or university, go on the website, look at the policies and procedures, see at what dollar threshold requires multiple quotes or a formal bid. But I would caution you to be careful about that, because each college or university is going to have different policies and regulations and bid thresholds. So you can't just look at Eric's site, for example, and think that's going to be the same for my college, because it won't be. So I encourage you, Sarah's got a great piece of advice there. Check out the websites, but it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation. So definitely look into each individual college or university that you're interested in working with. As far as engaging procurement, I agree with Eric. The beginning and the end would be fantastic, because we really can help you navigate the process, because it is a convoluted process when you're in public procurement. And we are not here to put up obstacles, but we are here to make sure we're in compliance. And as I mentioned before, we don't want you to get so far down a path with an end user and then find out that you have to start all over again because we didn't follow the policies.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I think what I'm hearing from all of you is actually like, it's okay to engage procurement. Don't be scared to engage procurement. And actually, the earlier you can engage procurement, the better. I know when we were having a prep call, I think it was Allison, you were mentioning, and we talked about this, where it stinks to say no on the procurement team. But even just shooting procurement a note sometimes and saying, hey, we're starting this conversation. This is coming up, and kind of like dual tracking that, because sometimes the end user won't necessarily be thinking about procurement or knowledgeable about their own entity's procurement practices too. So, and Eric, I think we'll take this one offline, but we did get a question. An anonymous attendee asked, any other friends at universities that share your same business philosophies? Please share, because having things like vendor meetings, et cetera, are not always the default. So maybe you can follow up or give a shout out towards the end for some other folks that kind of take this philosophy. It is true. I mean, I think not everyone really enjoys having those vendor meetings or being notified super early. But I think that's the direction that we see procurement heading in overall. And kudos to you guys for leading the charge and setting the tone. So with that context, I also want to talk about, because we mentioned these purchasing pathways. We talked a little bit about stakeholders, but now I want to shift over and talk about how do you kind of decide, when you're in procurement and working with those end users and with the supplier, which pathway to take. And we're specifically talking about those above threshold purchases when you're looking at, hey, we're going to solicit it, we're going to go to bid, or we're going to utilize a co-op contract. So Allison, maybe you can kick us off here in terms of what influences that decision.
Sure. So being at a small school, obviously the better pricing that we typically get by using a cooperative contract definitely plays a role, but it's not always just about the cost. Many times it's a matter of, do we have the time to do our own solicitation? Being a public college, when we're doing our own solicitation, we have to advertise it with the state for 21 days. We have to allow time for pre-bid meetings and presentations. It has to go to our board of trustees for final award approval before we can sign the contract, and we have to get on their agenda. So it could be a 3-month long process to do our own solicitation. And depending on the product or service that we need, we may not have that time. So that's when piggybacking a cooperative is a great advantage for us. Sometimes another factor we consider is if it's an off-the-shelf product or if it's a pretty standard, straightforward service, then that definitely lends more towards piggybacking a contract. If it's something more specific, like we have a special project on campus, we're constructing a new building, and we want an architect with some really specific prior experience, then we typically will do our own RFP.
Great. Yeah, so time is a huge factor, and then kind of category and level of specificity or uniqueness for the agency. Eric, do you take a similar path? How do you think about this?
Sure. So actually, I got a quick story, but it was just yesterday. So it's a story fresh in my mind. But athletics had reached out yesterday afternoon and was trying to figure out which way to go with a particular purchase. As Allison said, time is of essence in some of these decisions that have to be made. We were looking at some flooring for the weight room. They needed to make a decision really fast on which way it was going to go because of some circumstances beyond their control. So we started looking and perusing cooperative contracts, found out that the particular company they wanted had a particular contract, and we were able to save them a lot of time and effort. At first glance, due to volume, it would have required 2 quotes for us just for that one weight room. So they would have been out there competing. But for this particular example, like I mentioned, it was just an opportunity for us to help them achieve a goal. And time is of, like I said, the biggest essence we have. We have 4 buyers in our office, along with a manager. But most of the time, they're trying to maintain contracts that we put in place over the year, as well as just doing the day-to-day purchase orders, whatever else is involved. So time is huge. Everyone's efforts are involved in every kind of manner. When we're talking about my time, the supplier's time on their end, everyone's time, in fact. Our office has also done some research in the past on the cost to propose and the cost to procure. So those are always interesting conversations.
Yeah, I want to double click into that because it's something I know, is coming up for those of us, heading to Charlotte and the IGP forum next week. I know we're going to be talking more about this too. NCPP is launching a report to kind of collect this. But Eric, you and your team helped kick off this conversation, I think, among the public procurement community. So can you share a little bit more about what this is when we talk about cost to procure? Cost to propose. What are we talking about? How did you run these calculations? What did you think about?
Yeah, so we were just thinking really what it took from our side of the table to run a process. We did the flip on the other side and did it from the supplier side as well. But we wanted to kind of figure out, hey, how can we explain to our campus users what it costs to actually run this process? We did the same thing with purchase orders. Obviously, it's a lot lower dollar figure to that, but we did go through the process. We were here on this screen that you guys are looking at. As you can see, there's procurement staff involved. There is committees because we have to have committees. We have all their salaries. Now, this data is about 1.5 years, 2 years old. And it needs to be updated to tell the story of today's inflation as it is. So I would say that, when we're looking at this, we're keeping this in the back of our mind. And if there's a bigger, faster, better way to do something, we're trying to maneuver through it.
Yeah. Again, just kudos to you to kicking off this conversation. I know, NIGP Business Council brought you and Maria Grusa at Orange County together, kind of start this conversation. there's now a report that's coming out in the next couple weeks where I think about 40 or so public entities across the country have submitted their data. So we'll have a national average as well. And Pavilion is actually going to be launching a cost to procure calculator in the next couple weeks that allow folks to leverage that data and kind of just get an estimate, the same way if you've ever used like Redfin or Zillow, to kind of get an estimate for like, how much would it cost me to sell my home? Or like, how much is my home worth? A similar thing of like, can I take the data that's already out there without having to track for myself? But it's been a helpful conversation. I know as public servant, I didn't always feel like my time was valued in this way. So helpful to kind of shine a light on like, no, time is money, and there's an opportunity cost to taking one path over another that's worth considering. Allison, I know we've talked about this too, because a lot of this focus is kind of looking at like, what's it going to cost us to put this contract in place, assuming it will last for 1 year, but that's not always the lens we use too. So can you share a little bit more about how you think about sort of these costs overall?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're not looking at the annual cost anymore, or as you mentioned earlier, we're not looking at that individual purchase anymore. We're looking at the aggregate spend. So if it's a 5-year contract, then when we're talking about if it goes over our bid threshold or needs our board of trustees to approve it, we're looking at the total cost over that 5 years. So we're not just looking at the snapshots of procurement. We're looking at that total spend and factoring that into our decisions.
Great. And then Sarah, I know one of the things we also have talked about, and it's feedback we've received from folks participating in this kind of project that Eric and his team have launched, is thinking also about like, does this apply evenly across every single category? How do we think about changes, not just the time invested, but also across the different categories that might be eligible, or we might even think about using a co-op for. So can you speak a bit to your experience around like some of those shifts back from when you were in that direct public purchasing role?
Yes. So I think the biggest thing is that the decisions to bid can definitely change over time. For example, in my prior life, we used to bid out office supplies. That was a huge contract a long time ago, but the spend in office supplies has gone down over time. So instead of us going out and bidding it because we were going to get a better price based on our volume, it's now more cost effective for us to go ahead and adopt a cooperative instead. So there's a lot more conversation kind of going back to the cost to procure. Does it make sense? Is it a large enough spend? And spend for different categories has definitely gone up over the years, and other ones have gone down. So just because it was formally bid in the past does not guarantee that's going to be formally bid in the future. The other thing is that there's conversation, especially within our members, of trying to find those areas where there's more potential for cost savings. And the big one right now is consulting and services. Historically, that has not been something that is always formally bid in the past. And I think the cooperative area is also starting to grow within consulting and services. Typically, it was more of a regional type of contract versus national. But as we look for more opportunities, there's those additional categories that we need to be looking at as well.
Yeah, I think on the search intent side, we see a huge long tail of intent of folks just kind of checking, hey, is there anything I can use in this category, even if it's not traditionally one that might come to mind as being kind of cooperative purchasing eligible. So we're seeing kind of an expansion there as well. Okay, so thank you all. And now that we have a better understanding of the purchasing pathways and how suppliers might navigate them, I want to shift gears and talk about the money, budgets, because this is something that's special and we're thinking about and spending a few minutes on to higher ed. So many of the suppliers that are joining the conversation today also submitted questions around budgets. So we want to highlight a few of those here. So we'll talk through 3 things. I think first, budget cycles and seasonality. Second, funding sources. So grant funding has already come up and was certainly a hot topic in the questions as well. And then also, we'll touch on how student enrollment impacts higher ed budgets along the way as well. So let's start with budget cycles and seasonality. So again, Allison, Eric, I'd just love you to walk through what are your organization's budget cycles, and are there particular types of products or services that are more impacted by the seasonality considerations than others?
I'll start. So when I first came to higher ed, the budget cycle just blew my mind because it seems so long and stretched out. And a lot can change before you actually start spending the money that you budgeted for. And that just goes back again to being government funded. So we have to start gathering our budget numbers in early October. But that's for a budget that doesn't start until the following July. So we are months and months and months ahead of when we can actually spend that money. So we might be reaching out to our suppliers starting now, actually, to get some budgetary numbers, to get some quotes so that we can inform that budget that hopefully will get approved, but we can't actually make that purchase until next summer. So I understand from a supplier perspective, it could be a little frustrating that they're spending a lot of time helping us get budgetary numbers together, but they're not going to see the end result of that until next summer. But that is what our budget cycle is. And it's really important that those budget numbers be as accurate as possible, because if something is $25,000 and that's what the number we put in the budget, then that's the number that gets approved for us to spend. We don't have the flexibility, almost a year from now, to increase that spend by like $10,000. So if we budgeted 25, the pricing comes in next July at 35, we don't have the extra $10,000 to put towards that purchase. Something else would have to get cut in order to accommodate, or maybe that item will get cut to accommodate something else. So it's really important for us to have the close relationships with our suppliers, so that they are responsive to us when we're looking for those budgetary numbers. And it's a number that we can have confidence in as we go through the budget approval process. And it's something else that can be a little difficult to understand when you're working with public procurement, higher ed, is just because a supplier gave us that budgetary quote in September, it doesn't mean they're automatically getting that order the following summer. Depending on how much that item or service is, we will still have to put that out for bids or find a cooperative contract to use.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing here is be patient.
Yes, please.
And also have an understanding and some empathy with the cycles. And it is helpful, not just for the supplier, but obviously for the organization, to make sure that you're responding and getting that budget worked in. But it won't always happen immediately. So Eric, would love to hear more about your experience here.
Sure. So ours is about the same, actually, and I could say ditto to Allison, but I will expand a little bit by just saying that, we plan for these things, and like Allison said, October we start, March, April we finalize. Those numbers sit on a desk at the governor's office until he signs in June, right before the end of the year, right? So who knows how the political climate is going to affect anything that you have. Somebody could come in and say, "Oh, I have this great project from a constituent standpoint, and all your line item things get vetoed and other ones go forward." So it's always a risk. But as I always say, our suppliers that we work with day in and day out, I've really started terming them as contract partners. Or partners of the university, rather than just being a supplier. And those that are true partners want to be there for you and want to help you build this case of having, whether it's a quote or you need this done or whatever it might be. They are a true partner to your university. And as we create those relationships, you hope that they last for 5 to 10 to 20 years once they're in place.
Great. Yeah, I want to you touched on politics, which I know is top of mind for a lot of us, and how that will affect, budgets. I think another factor that we talked about is also enrollment, and how that might impact budgets as well. So, Sarah, can you speak a bit to how you kind of see enrollment impact budgets across NAEP members? What you kind of see across the gamut?
Yes, absolutely. So, the vast majority of our members have fiscal years that run from July to June. And there are some that have some different ones, but with that July to June timeframe, sometimes budgets can get set in April with the new budget year starting in July. But when you look at the academic year, students aren't confirmed final enrollment. Sometimes those students are making that decision a week before school starts. So those student numbers aren't confirmed until August or September. So if the budgets are based on a certain enrollment number and those enrollment numbers come in way lower, your budgets can end up getting affected by that and need to drop either later that semester or even following in the second semester. So while our members may have budget in July, if those enrollment numbers aren't there in September, October, they could start seeing cuts on the budgets and they would no longer have the money to be able to move forward with the project. So enrollment numbers definitely affect those budgets, and it is kind of a last minute effect sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's a good flag that like just because it's budgeted, it's not a guarantee, and that those things can shift over time. I think on the cooperative purchasing side, we see as a resource for buyers to come in and search. We're able to collect some insights, and we see that from search activity from higher ed in particular, demand for purchasing through co-op contracts is highest in the fall semester, really peaking in October. So now that we're in mid-August or towards the end of August, where you can see the interest in co-op purchasing is ramping up pretty quickly. And before budgets might get adjusted with enrollment considerations or other factors like Sarah and others mentioned, that's kind of this critical time. So what it means for suppliers with cooperative contracts is that you want to make sure that you're effectively positioning those contracts now to capture those opportunities. We did have a very quick question actually from the audience as well, which is around understanding the budget cycle more, which is when you're gathering budgets and finalizing for approval, is that when you're also suggesting a category to bid for the next fiscal year? So basically, have you decided to go co-op or to solicit at that point, or are you just kind of getting the budget together? I don't know if anyone wants to chime in there.
I mean, I can jump in, but I think that's actual facts is that we're just gathering data right early on. I think later on we will put out or start looking for that final option, but we do need that budgetary number starting in October to like the March timeframe, like I was saying, to kind of know where we need to be for the next year. And then once we get those in place, we can actually move forward with the solicitation or whatever it is. We don't want to give anybody any false hope that we're going to move forward with that project if the funding actually doesn't come through.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. Eric, Allison, just very quickly, are there certain types of products or services that you're typically looking to purchase through co-ops or these shareable contracts in the fall, or the things that are kind of top of mind or that come up pretty regularly?
Go ahead, Allison.
So for us right now, this is a very timely question. We are looking at stocking up our labs. So science, medical, industrial trades, lab supplies and equipment. This is a big time of year for that. Many of our facilities purchases are throughout the year. It just depends on the project that's budgeted for the year and when it's the best time to do it. Like we don't want to do an air conditioning project in the summer. Right, we're looking at the shoulder seasons. If we have paving involved, there's only certain times a year when you can pave. So some of it is more cyclical depending on the item or the service, more so than our academic calendar.
Yeah, and I really couldn't think of any great examples for myself, except for the fact that our president has tasked the University of North Florida with being at 25,000 students by 2028, and we are at 17,000 currently, so we have a long way to go. And we're starting to bid things like dorms and looking into P3s and new academic buildings. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for a lot of different vendors. So I expect to hear from some of y'all after this.
And one more thing to note, sometimes there's a bad time of year to buy something. So if you have a big event coming up or student move-in or, the different things, campus activities, that's not the time when we want to be looking at closing a roadway or putting scaffolding up next to a building or something like that. So sometimes it's the campus activities that drive the timing of the procurement and the work to be done as well.
Yeah, that's a great call out. Okay, I want to shift gears and talk to one more piece on funding that's important for higher ed institutions that also came up in some of the questions. And that's kind of a reminder around like, what are the typical funding sources for your institutions? So how does grant funding, federal funding, different kind of flow of money impact how you buy? So Allison, do you want to share a little bit of your experience first, and then Eric,
Sure.
I'll kick it over to you.
So for my college, our funding comes from the state, our local counties, since we are a community college, tuition, which is directly tied to enrollment, and grants. And those could be federal or state grants, or sometimes we have some private funding sources. And so that goes back again to what Sarah was talking about how even when you think your budget is set, lower enrollment could decrease that budget. Changes in your state leadership could impact the budget too. In Maryland, we had a governor who highly supported higher ed. We have a different governor now who has cut higher ed, sometimes mid-year. So those funding sources can definitely ebb and flow. Even when you think something is static, it's really not. So we have to be able to be responsive to that, and that definitely impacts what we're buying and when we're buying. And for grants, typically the grant period will dictate when the procurement cuts off. All of your purchase orders have to be issued by a certain date, so we have to be mindful of that as well.
Great. Eric, anything to add there?
Nothing to add. I'll pass it along to Sarah.
Thank you. One thing that I want to note is federal uniform guidance impacts our NAP member institutions who receive federal funding. That's both public and private. So depending on the institution's procurement procedures, the process that they have may be the same for federal, or it may be drastically different when federal money is involved. So that can affect timelines, the formal bid thresholds, sole source requirements, or even the ability to utilize a cooperative contract. So there's definitely a set of rules for federal procurement that our members would follow.
Yeah. So if you're curious as a supplier, you can learn and just talk to the procurement team around, are there certain funding requirements that we should be aware of, and regulations that are kind of extra or special around what we understand that we need to follow. So now that we've talked about budgets and some of the factors there, just want to hone in finally on cooperative contracts as well. So as we've all discussed, cooperative procurement has oftentimes more often been used for commodities, kind of more standardized services. And we are not only seeing that there's a growing preference for cooperative procurement overall, but that, as I shared earlier, that preference is being extended to more diverse categories also. So from the search activity we see on Pavilion, we see that higher ed organizations are really looking to use cooperative procurement for more traditional categories like technology, scientific or medical supplies, furniture, but also now for things like facilities and construction, like lighting equipment, staffing, recruitment, and so on. So just kind of a proliferation of categories and desire, I think, to use those shareable contracts. Sarah, I'm curious what you've heard from NAEPM members around products or services that cooperative procurement is being used for.
So a lot of times we hear from our members, like, do you have a bid or have you bid out X item or service before? And that could be that they could utilize that through a cooperative contract, or maybe there's a contract that they can piggyback through. One example that always comes to mind from past experience, this is a little dated, but when drones first came on the scene, that was something that a lot of researchers needed to be able to purchase. And so that was a new category for procurement professionals to be able to go out and find what was the best option out there. So if there's no good contracts that have already been solicited for that, that you're aware of, at least within your own organization, that's an opportunity to utilize a cooperative contract out there, or be able to find a contract that has piggyback language, which that's where Pavilion comes in as a great resource, is to be able to find those contracts that are out there from maybe another member institution that has that piggyback language. From a perspective of a supplier, it's also really good if you are providing a new technology and you're putting a contract in place with an institution to try and get piggyback language in there. So that benefits not only the supplier for this new technology, but it also benefits our members. Because again, new technologies, new services are very difficult and can be very time consuming to need to purchase.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. And I also just wanted to share, we looked at what kinds of contracts that higher ed institutions are viewing on Pavilion. So you can see some of the organizations that show up are not just cooperatives, national purchasing cooperatives, but also state and local agencies and higher ed institutions. And again, these are not in particular order, just an assortment of some of the sources that we see are popular among higher ed organizations on Pavilion. Eric, Allison, Sarah, I'm curious how you think about, as practitioners, like which contracts to purchase off of. What matters in terms of your preferences here?
So our preference is always going to be to piggyback a contract that was solicited by another higher ed institution or a state or local government agency. We do use the other national cooperatives, but our preference is higher ed or the state or local agencies because, for one, they typically don't charge a contract administration fee to the supplier. So then that typically results in better pricing for us. And the other is because I have confidence in their procurement process. So when we're piggybacking a contract, we really do have to read all of the RFP documents, the contract that results, to make sure that they followed the same solicitation process that I have to follow, that they have terms and conditions that I can agree to, that the product or the service is included in the contract. I have to make sure that it has a piggyback clause, for example. And sometimes the contract will detail how it is to be used. So we have to make sure that we use it in the same way. For example, if they award it to multiple suppliers with the intent that every time you need some work done, you're going to get quotes from those 4 suppliers, then we have to do that. We can't just pick one of those and award a contract and go on. So we have to follow the intent of the solicitation that we're piggybacking. So it's important, I think, for suppliers to understand that we really are reading all those documents, and we have to follow how it was intended to be done.
Yeah, thank you for that. Eric, how about you? What matters in your opinion?
Yeah, so we fall in that same boat. I'm not always tied to another university or agency like Allison. Co-ops can be a good thing. They can also be a bad thing. There are some partners out there that are better than others. And I think it's just up to that university to do their due diligence, make sure that all the data is there to make sure that you're doing what you need to do to meet your state laws. We've created a piggyback check sheet or a check sheet that we go down every time we kind of adopt an agreement from a cooperative or another institution, even because some of them even include that language where it's only good for their particular state. It may not be good for my state. So, there's a lot of things that we look for in that checklist, and I would say anybody that wants that, I'll be glad to share it with them as well.
Awesome. We can include that in our follow-up if you want to share. Sarah, what about you? What do you hear from NAEP members?
Again, kind of reiterating what both Allison and Eric said, it's finding the contract that best meets the needs of the institution. So whether that is with a cooperative or being able to find a contract that you can piggyback off of, you have to keep in mind the policies and procedures that you have at your institution. That ultimately is what it comes down to, because the biggest thing is making sure that you're still in compliance. If you adopt or utilize a contract that is not in compliance with your policies and procedures, it's not going to be a good fit for you.
Yeah. Sounds good. Well, and I know, again, we're excited to help members share more with each other. I know, Allison, you also called out some local groups in higher ed. I think one in Virginia, where you're like, hey, they've actually done a great job working together and kind of meeting the needs of their members.
I see VASCUP on your higher ed list, and that is an association of the colleges and universities in the state of Virginia. And they do some cooperatives, and they have a great website with all the contracts out there. And so VASCUP's doing a really good job of that.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. I think just generally before we wrap up, and we have a lot of questions, which I know we're not going to get to all of them. So I'll pass those along as well to our panelists afterwards in case you want to chime in any of the follow-ups for the ones we didn't get a chance to cover. But just to wrap up, want to get you sort of high level, like number one concern or advice that you have for suppliers who are joining us today as it relates to selling into procurement in higher ed or leveraging cooperative contracts.
I guess
Any final pearls of wisdom?
But I would just say at this point, I hope you guys understand that I'm a pretty laid back kind of person. You're welcome to come into my office at any point in time, ask me any questions, phone me any day. I try to answer as many phone calls and emails as I can. My main concern, though, at the end of the day is I really love my job. I really love what I do. I really want to stay in Jacksonville for a while. But I want to make sure that, the state auditors are not coming to slap my hand also, or I'm behind bars because I'm doing something illegally. We are, as a procurement office, responsible for all the dollars being spent at this university. So we need to make sure that we're doing it the correct way. And, that's why we ask for your help sometimes. So that would be my biggest concern that's still overhanging.
I definitely ditto on that. And the only thing I would add as it pertains to our topic today, as far as advice for suppliers, is to really know and understand the contracts that you hold. Because when we meet with you and we want to piggyback a contract, we're really looking at you to have some answers on that as well. And sometimes we meet with suppliers and they're really excited because the cooperative contract gets a foot in the door, but then they're not familiar with the contract. And I'm trying to have a conversation about how we can execute and what's included. So I need a supplier partner who is also very familiar with the contracts that they hold.
Great. Sarah, any final words of wisdom?
Yeah. So as far as like concerns, I would say for NAP members, probably one of their biggest concerns that we see is finding a reliable business partner who provides best value. Good procurement operations are continuously assessing their existing contracts, their business relationships, what's going on in the market to ensure that they're getting the best value for their institution. It's really important for business partners not to assume that just because they were awarded a contract or provided a contract that the business is guaranteed. They need to build those relationships with the campus community beyond procurement to ensure that the contract is successful and that it continues to grow and provide what the university needs at a great value.
Perfect. Thanks. So we covered a lot of ground today. We're at time. So I'll just summarize. I think what I want everyone to take away from today's session is that, hey, higher ed purchasing can be complex, but there are a lot of different ways to engage not just the end user champions, but also procurement teams early to help you navigate the sale. And if you have cooperative contracts, you should make sure you're promoting them. And as Sarah, you just mentioned, training your sales teams. And Allison, I think you touched on this too, training your sales teams on how they can be used so they know what they're talking about. A couple final things before we wrap. We heard today that buyers are increasingly looking towards purchasing through cooperative contracts. And for suppliers, Pavilion helps you get your co-op contracts in front of entities when they're looking to purchase. So it's free for you to have contracts on our site. It's free to receive business. And we also offer some paid features and services that help you generate even more sales off of those contracts. So if you want to learn more about that and how we can help, go ahead and send me an email. And then Sarah, I know you've talked a little bit about NAP, but we've listed info here about how suppliers can learn more about NAEP. And then we're also sharing out a feedback survey, which we've just dropped in the chat. We'd love if you can take no more than 30 seconds, just quickly fill it out. We're always hungry for feedback on how we can continue to improve and offer valuable content to the ecosystem. So please take a moment to fill that out. Sarah, did you want to share just a little bit more about NAEP? And then I think we'll drop. We'll also take these questions and pass them along to panelists in case they have any answers that they want to share that we can loop in with some of the follow-up as well. I know we didn't get to as many of those. I answered a few live or directed them live, but not as many as we wanted to. I know there are more.
Yeah, absolutely. I would strongly encourage suppliers to look for a way to engage with our NAP members. We have national and regional meetings that happen throughout the year. They have sponsorship and exhibiting opportunities, but beyond that, those in-person conferences are a great way to network with our members through different events that we have. You can participate in the learning opportunities, which is a great way to learn more about how public procurement works. And then there's also the exhibiting opportunities there as well to be able to network and build your connections with different procurement professionals.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much, Eric, Allison, Sarah. It was great having this conversation with you. I know we've gone a few minutes over, but also thank you to everyone who's attended, participated. You asked some great questions. We'll capture those, pass them along to our panelists in case y'all have any that you're like, oh, I need the supplier to know this. We can send them out if you care to answer any async. And thanks again for taking the time with us today. We really enjoyed the conversation. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
See you later.